Greetings, everyone. I'm Mohammed Hafiz, the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Chronicles study. I welcome you to our Elahé Mir-Djalali lecture series and book lunch, sponsored by the Encyclopedia Chronicle Foundation and the Department of History at York University. I'm grateful to the Foundation's Board of Directors and colleagues at York University for their invaluable support. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Leila Tavakoli and Shabnam Rahimi for organizing the workshop on gender and the archive the past several days, and for their invaluable efforts and support. Today's talk is the third in the series of lectures in solidarity with the impressive Iranian women's movement and women, life, liberty. And our speaker today is sort of, her work has been the prehistory of the movement today. Everything that you read in her books written earlier sort of somehow anticipates this moment. It is an honor to launch Professor Najmabadi's Familial Undercurrents, which was released earlier this year by Duke University Press. I would like to thank Professor Najmabadi for accepting our invitation to join us in person at the University of Toronto. This session is, in fact, our first in-person gathering. At the outset, before introducing our distinguished guests, I'd like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, the city place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and are grateful to have the opportunity to live, teach, and learn on their ancestral homeland. Our distinguished guest, Afsaneh Najmabadi, is a leading historian of modern Iran, and many of you are familiar with her extraordinary scholarship and historiographical contribution. As a refresher author, I will offer a concise introduction. Afsaneh Najmabadi is the Francis Lee Higgins Professor of History, Studies of Women, Gender and Sexuality at Harvard University. She was the founding editor of myriad, a pioneering feminist research journal published within the spring of 1984 and the fall of 1999. Myriad inaugurated a significant shift in Iranian studies by bringing serious scholarly attention to women as agents of historical change. In addition to numerous stellar and groundbreaking articles, Professor Najmabadi has published several pioneering books in Persian and English. Her Persian books include the 1992 Monogamous, Vices of Men, and edited and annotated publication of the 19th century manuscript by the Tavakoli-Targhi, and the 1995 Tehran, an original women-centered account of the constitutional revolution of 1905-1911. The Tehran was published in English and the story of the daughters of the time, gender, and national memory in Iranian history by Cyprus University in 1998. Exploring the life of the author of Mir-Djalali in 1996, She co-edited the Khanum and Tavakoli and Khanum and Afsaneh with Mechanism and Law. This was followed by the 1999 publication of Civil Tavakoli, Letters, Writing, and Remembrances co-edited with Mahmoud Sanahati volumes. In 2001, she co-edited Nezakeh Nisbani Shad, a collection of documents from and about the Second Women's Congress, Congress of Peace in 1932. In addition to these Persian language books, Afsaneh Najmabadi published several groundbreaking books in English. Her 2005, Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards, Gender and Sexual Anxiety of Iranian Modernity, is the most original and groundbreaking research on modern Iran. In recognition of her exemplary contribution to women's history and feminist theory, she received the 2005 Joan Kelly Memorial Prize from the American Historical Association. Women with Mustaches was followed by her 2014 Professing Selves, Transsexuality and Same-Sex Desire in Contemporary Iran. Exemplifying Afsaneh's extraordinary intellectual and historiographical originality, Professing Selves was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in 2014, and again received the 2014 Joan Kelly Prize from the American Historical Association, and was the co-winner of the 2015 John Boswell Prize LGBT History from the American Historical Association. Her new book, Familial Undercurrents, Untold History, Stories of Love and Marriage in Modern Iran, establishes a higher bar for intellectual and scholarly originality and bravery in Iranian studies. With this book, Afsaneh rocks not only the academic conventions, but also the foundational rock of modern Iranian family. Familial Undercurrents should be read along with one's parents and grandparents. Unfortunately, I don't have that broken down. For our session today, my colleague, Professor Tavakoli-Targhi of York University, will be the discussant and will moderate the session. Please join me in welcoming Professor Najmabadi to the Elahé and Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies.
This book is inspired by a personal story. In early March 1987, I received a phone call from Tehran. On the other side of a bad connection, the man claimed he was my brother-in-law, married to my sister, Mina. I had never before known of a sister named Mina. This was a short few months after my father's death in October 1986 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Rather shocked, I asked him to send me any corroborating documents, discontinued the conversation, and conveniently tucked it away into forgetfulness. I disbelieved the claim, and for a combination of reasons, including my mother's distress and refusal to meet with them on her visits to Iran, I did not connect with Mina until 20 years later. In 2005, I began to visit Iran regularly. I met Mina for the first time in 2007. Slowly and hesitantly, I established a relationship with her. But then I became gripped with a detective fever, with an obsession to know about my father's other family, the family he had kept a secret from us. Over the following years, I interviewed numerous people on Mina's mother's side of the family, my father's side of the family, and my mother's as well. A much more complicated and fascinating family story emerged from these conversations. As I learned the story of this other family, I had to trace and retrace many times over. I would find a new piece of information that would splice together previously disconnected episodes. At the same time, filling those gaps would push apart other episodes I thought had fit together. Smoothing one set of edges would frustratingly create other rag moments that would refuse to fit. The second family turned out to include a first love and many unexpected turns and twists. Over the many years that I followed these conversations, the stories often changed from one telling to another. At the end, a relatively coherent story, for the most part, took shape. Mina's mother, Mansoureh, had had a roughly sixth grade formal education. In subsequent years, in the mid-1930s, he had been tutored in literary and religious texts by my father's father. Apparently, he had tutored several members of Mansoureh's family and socialized with them, all the way to the end of his life in 1948. Mansoureh was possibly also tutored in math by my father, Abbas. This is how they met. My father fell in love with her and asked for her hand in marriage. Apparently, Mansoureh was also fond of my father. Her mother, however, opposed the marriage. She had already promised her daughter to her brother's son, who was also very much in love with Mansoureh. My paternal grandfather, Elahé, had also been very fond of Mansoureh. I was told by Mina's husband that at one point my grandfather even considered transferring the title deed of his house to her name. This was rather unusual. Was this reported intention meant to support the veracity of the first love story? Why would he transfer this property to persuade Mansoureh's mother to let her son marry her daughter? But then one would expect him to turn the ownership to Abbas, as it was done in numerous marriage contracts. Usually part of the match included property that belonged to the groom's father, and then the groom's father would turn that property over to the groom, but never to the bride. In any case, if that was the intention, it failed. Mansoureh and her cousin were contractually married on 26th of May, 1936. However, their marriage was not consummated for another 6 years in October 1942, at which point Mansoureh renegotiated her match, increasing it from 8,000 to 60,000 riyals. 6 years was a rather long period between signing the marriage contract and its consummation. That too was unusual. A time lapse between the formal marriage contract and the wedding was not unusual, but it usually lasted between a few months or at most a couple of years. Sometimes the bride was considered not physically mature enough for consummation of marriage, or sometimes the groom needed the time to prepare properly for his wife-to-be. But 6 years was highly unusual. For a couple of years, Mansoureh's husband had been away on military service, but then how to explain the other 4 years? Was Mansoureh resisting the wedding, hoping her cousin would release her from the marriage contract? In the meantime, in September 1941, my father, Abbas, had met my mother, Farhi, fallen in love with her, and married her in January 1942. Was that why Mansoureh eventually resigned herself to the marriage with her cousin in October 1942? Farhi and Mansoureh had 2 daughters in exactly the same years, 1944 and 1946. Throughout the 1940s, Both Abbas and his father had continued to visit Mansour. She was apparently unhappy with her marriage. Her husband was a member of the Tudeh party. He couldn't hold a steady job and would be fired frequently for his labor organizing. Money was not an issue since he had inherited much property near Tehran. But apparently the unsettled pattern of life was unbearable for Mansour. In 1947, she asked for her full man to be paid, presumably hoping to bargain it back in exchange for a divorce. Her husband turned over all his properties to her, but refused to divorce her for another 5 years. By all family accounts, this was because he had been so in love with her that he wouldn't give up hope for a possible reconciliation. In the meantime, Abbas had purchased a piece of land in September 1948, close to where Mansour had been living, built a house on it, and turned the house to Mansour in the spring of 1949. This enabled her to move out of her marital home and live with her children in the new house, which she shared with her mother and for a few years with her grandmother as well. Mansour remained on friendly terms with her cousin, even after the divorce and her marriage to Abbas. Her now ex-husband visited the girls frequently. Once Mina was born, he was very kind and fatherly to her as well. Mina recalled fondly some of the gifts that he had brought her, including a first camera. In effect, not only had my father kept two families through the legal possibility of bigamy, but Mansour too had two men in her life from the mid-1930s to the time of her cousin's death in 1980. One was her husband, the other a family friend. By the early 1950s, they switched position. The cousin ex-husband continued to visit the family as a friend. Mansour had managed to keep the two men openly as family. My father chose to hide one family from the other. This at first seemed quite counterintuitive, that the woman seemed to have had more leeway than the man. During these years of playing family detective, I also started talking about my family story to anyone willing to listen. In almost every instance, the response was something like, "Oh yes, so-and-so in my family acted similarly. Only after his death, we learned he had another wife." The repetition of the pattern made it clear that my father's secret family was not simply a quirky exception. It seems that over a short generation, what had been an acceptable open practice, men's polygyny, had become, for at least a layer of urban, educated, middle-class Iranian men, something socially frowned upon. It was something to keep secret, even though it was not illegal. After all, my mother had grown up in a bigamous household, while my father's father had married only once. Numerous men in the larger Najmabadi clan of his father's generation had more than one wife. Beyond my personal family story, I thus became preoccupied with understanding this larger pattern of change in familial practices. This book aims at a historical contextualization of the changes in ideas of what constituted the family, how these changes came about, and how practices of family life adapted or did not. One of the issues that I faced in writing this book is about the ethics of telling stories that people did not want to be told. My mother chose not to talk about my father's second marriage with anyone beyond a couple of her siblings and nieces, nor did she even hint at it in her interviews in the 1990s and in her written memoirs. My father had kept his second family a secret from the first to his dying days. Their silence posed for me throughout the work on this project the unresolvable ethical dilemma that many autobiographies, writers, and memoirists have faced, have noted. As Nancy Miller has put it, memoir writers necessarily blur the lines between autobiography and biography, self and other, especially when a child tells the parent's story. Telling these stories is to receive a past that is ours, but not ours alone. What right did I have to write my parents' story when they had chosen silence? Shouldn't I respect my father's secrecy and my mother's desire for keeping his knowledge confined? I understood my father's keeping the secret marriage, the second marriage secret, to have been an effect of middle-class modernist and Baha'i embarrassments, if not shame, over his bigamy, his way of living. His way of living love for Mansoureh under circumstances that had made that option no longer a publicly acceptable practice. As Deborah Cohen has put it in a different context, secrecy guaranteed both security and authenticity. In my father's case, the authenticity of his being a modern Baha'i, whose new faith emphasized monogamy much more strongly than his old faith, and practices in his parental generation had insecurity from the possibility of losing Targhi and the custody of his two children, me and my sister Fars, a possibility that had been shaped by my mother's education and professional life, as well as the support she received from her family, inclusive of her sister's husband, who was my father's uncle too. Secrecy guaranteed both. I understood my mother's desire for keeping a relative silence over that belated knowledge as her way of saving face, of remaining respectful, as many relatives had said, in circumstances where things going wrong in marriage had been default seen as shortcomings of the wife. But things mattered only if they were known. Keeping silent made keeping face possible. I thus justified my desire to tell their story as my way of attempting to open up the possibility of reducing injury and disrespect, embarrassment and shame over their life choices. It is at times said that historians are motivated by the desire to speak of the dead, and even more, to speak on behalf of the dead. Some of the recent decades of recuperative historiography have indeed been informed by this desire to compensate for silences in history and give voice to the silenced. Yet what of the desire of the dead to remain silent? What of the lives made possible through keeping silent? Quite early on, when I first started thinking about this project, I contacted one of my maternal cousins to inquire about memories of our mothers and our grandmother. She was reluctant to talk. She wrote that her first reaction was that I wanted to protect them and their legacy. Would my mother or yours want to have the public exposed to the family secrets? What right did I have, she insisted, to tell the stories of family members unable to speak for themselves? At the time, I shrugged this objection off, largely because I was thinking of my writing as an act of empathy with these lives, not as critical judgment of their choices, decisions, and lives lived. As my work developed, I was even more certain that I could write in total empathy with all my characters, though at times empathy with my father would become challenging. Nonetheless, my cousin's early warning remained an echo in my head that wouldn't go away. Conversations with other relatives would bring it back in new context. A paternal uncle talked about several incidents he had heard about, two related to my father's scandalous behavior, apparently propositioning other women from the family. but several were about other people. So many family men scandals, we began to joke about whether this was a genetic trait. Each time, he made it clear that none of these stories were meant for retelling. He emphasized that even though he talked about these stories to me, this had been a very rare thing for him to do. He definitely would not want any story to be retold. Another relative told similar stories about Najmabadi men, repeatedly prefacing each story by saying, I don't engage in gossip. May God forgive me, but the repeated disavowal of gossip in conversation with Arafat Raza and his dissertation on ethics of speech in the formation of early Islamic piety brought forth another layer of this shadowy weight on my writing. I too had grown up within an ethics of speech centered on restraint of the tongue. This ethic was not simply located within the high Islamic culture of text and teaching on piety within books of ethics and injunctions to the pious. I too had grown up with cautions concerning excesses of talking that seemed to often repeated advice. Why do you think God has given you 2 ears and 1 tongue? Hear twice before you talk once. Most severely, the narrative attributed to the Prophet on gossip was often repeated, al-ghiba ashaddu min az-zina, roughly translated as gossip is worse than fornication. Given that telling about someone else's sinful deed is considered a sin, perhaps even a more severe sin than the committing of the sin itself, how does one go about telling other people's lives, sins and all? Given the culture of keeping things unsaid, letting things pass rather than be told and retold, how ethical is my writing of other people's stories? If we take gossip itself as a critical way of knowing, indeed at times as a weapon of the weak, as an important source for historical cultural understanding, how do we deal with the shadow of shame hanging over the knowledge generated through gossip? Within this kind of cultural ethos, how does one write about family secrets in a way that does not do harm to others' sensibilities? Is there a way of telling a story that had chosen not to tell? They had chosen not to tell that would open up possibilities of reducing injury and disrespect. Do I just not tell things that were too scandalous? Clearly, my father didn't want the family on this side of town to know about the family on the other side of town. His story had, of course, already come out after his death because of legal requirements related to inheritance division. But even then, it had remained known only within a limited circle of people. Yet over the past years, my pursuit of his story had made it known to ever wider circles of people. Each time when I started a conversation with another relative by saying, did you know my father had another wife? I made that circle of knowing larger. Writing and publishing a book would make it known to an even wider circle. The ethics and politics of retrieving a past that is not ours alone is not simply a memoirist dilemma, of course. This is what historians do all the time. Usually we have no reason to assume that the stories retrieved are objectionable to those whose stories we have retrieved. But we also usually have no information on whether it would not be objectionable. For characters unknown to us personally, we tend not to worry. What are the ethics of using what we save or have been entrusted to keep? My parents had come to London in the winter of 1980 to visit me and my family. They had planned to stay a month or so, then go to Phoenix, Arizona to visit my sister. The visit became an immigration. We insisted that they were retired and both their children were abroad, live in Iran, especially in the middle of nowhere on the outskirts of a small town during the early revolutionary years of upheaval, and with attacks against Baha'i, seemed to be too risky to return to. Even though my father's conversion might not have been locally known, why not stay for a while in the United States until things calmed down? We kept them abroad. They had come with 2 suitcases. The following spring, on my visit to Tehran, I selected things to bring for them. Some clothes, a few books, a selection of photographs from family albums, and a bunch of letters tied together. I recognized my father's handwriting over the first year of my parents. Together, I recognized my father's handwriting. On closer inspection, they turned out to be letters my father had written over the first year of my parents' marriage when he was not in Tehran with his new bride. Those also came with me. At one point, when my mother was angry with my father after she had found out about his other wife, she had wanted to throw them away. I told her I would like to save them. They became mine, though I did not read them until my familial detective journey began in 2014. Is it ethical to use my father's letters to my mother, which she wanted to throw out, just because I asked her to let me keep them and she agreed? At the time, of course, neither she nor I had any reason to imagine that some 2 decades later, I would be writing this manuscript. What makes them mine to use for this project? Nor is it just a problem of relation to my own family history. Since 2009, I have worked on women's works in Qajar, Iran, a digital archive and website. We visit families to photograph and digitize the relevant documents, photographs, and objects of daily life. Within that context, I have heard numerous stories of lives. A photograph brings out a memory. An object becomes an occasion for recalling your relative's wedding. Yet another family story. When families have agreed, we have recorded these stories and the audio files are available to the public. Some stories we were explicitly told were not for public. We either did not take them or else kept them unpublished. But I, as the writer of these lines, have heard them. There's no way of erasing them from my mind. Invariably, these stories have impacted how I understood other documents and objects from their family, and have also influenced my thinking about other people's lives. At times, I have changed names and details in order to use a family vignette. Is that an ethical use of stories I heard? There is a similar problem in relation to my conversations with my own relatives. This was not a structured ethnographical project. When I began to visit and speak with my relatives in pursuit of understanding my parents' life and my father's other family, I had no plan or thought of writing a book. I just wanted to know, especially to know my father, who had suddenly become an enigmatic character to me. I just did not seek formal permissions for what I might, in some future date, do with what I heard. I did not take these conversations. Often at the end of the day, recalling the conversations and writing about them was my way of reflecting over my parents' lives. When I decided there was a story worth telling, only then did I begin to take formal notes and tape some of the conversations. Again, I have changed names, relations, and details, but is it ethical to use stories told by people when they had no idea, nor did I, that their stories could be retold in writing? The privileged access I've had to one family's papers extend decades before the WWQI project or any imagined manuscripts I would be writing, further complicating the issue of the use of such papers in subsequent research. In 1992, I had edited and published an 1894 previously unpublished manuscript by Mir-Djalali, Mir-Djalali, Vices of Men. In winter 1994, I received a letter from one of her granddaughters, Mir-Djalali Mandal. Thus began my correspondence with her, which subsequently developed into visiting the family. Mir-Djalali said that she had prepared the life narrative of her mother, Afsaneh, and wished to publish it. Several years before Afsaneh passed away in 1980, one of her sons, Hussein Ali Mandal, had recorded an extensive interview with her about her life. A few years after her death, upon her brother's suggestion, Mir-Djalali had transcribed the interviews. She had then prepared a narrative of her mother's life based on the transcript and other family information, but composed as if in Afsaneh's voice. She inquired if I was interested to help with its publication. I was, of course, delighted. I asked whether the original tapes were available. They were not. After the transcriptions, the tapes had been reused for new recordings, very common in Iran at the time, given the price of cassette tapes and a dominant recycling culture. I requested a copy of full transcript, upon which she ventriculized manuscript had been based. This came months later, in July 1997, after her book had been published. I read it immediately and was taken back by how much had been removed or radically changed, and how much had been added into the published text that was not there. I found the original interview transcription immensely more powerful and felt that it had been a pity to have transformed it into a different text. Soon one of Mir-Djalali's nieces contacted me and expressed interest in translating her aunt's book into English. Giving a couple of examples from the transcription, I asked Mir-Djalali if we could add section from the transcript into the English translation. She declined, feeling that such inclusion would upset her consideration of keeping everyone satisfied. She did not wish to write things that would cast life in Mazandaran. Much of her mother's interviews had been centered on her life there in a negative light. The English translation was not published. Decades later, the transcription was digitized and added to Mandal collection on the WWQI site. By then, Mir-Djalali had passed away. There was no way of knowing if she would have given her permission for this inclusion. Knowing Mir-Djalali's earlier reluctance, was it ethical on my part to push for its inclusion, thus making it available worldwide? Was this interview transcript hers, her brother's, her mother's? I could tell myself that this was an anti-censorship measure, given how much Mir-Djalali had changed her mother's account in the first place. Yet I cannot stop thinking that my insistence must have had something to do with the fact that the shift within one generation in narratives about familial life as evidence in a comparison of the transcription and the published text aligned with my thinking about changes in concepts and practices of marriage and family perfectly as to make it its broader availability to historians irresistible. I'm going to stop here and difficult questions as to which I don't know. So I invite all of you to come to my rescue and answer your questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, both in person and online. There's a note for the folks that are joining online. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and someone is recording this. in the audience. I heard there was some sound problems, but I think they've been resolved.
Sort of. So if you can really use the mics, that'd be great.
Okay. So I want to begin by thanking Professor Tavakoli for hosting us today, and maybe more broadly for creating such a fertile, creative, and generative environment for Iranian studies at both the University of Toronto, the City of Toronto, Field of European Studies. I also want to thank Afsaneh Najmabadi for all her support in organizing this event. This event and so much of what is done in the name of Iranian studies at the City of Toronto would not have been possible without her tireless efforts. Thank you, Afsaneh. It's such an honor to be hosting Professor Najmabadi in Toronto today, and I feel very privileged to be sharing the stage with her. So many of us in this room have benefited from her pioneering scholarship, as Professor Tavakoli mentioned, that she's been producing over the last several decades. I know I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my early encounter with her scholarship. And certainly her work has instructed and inspired many of you here today. And at this point, I can say to say, several generations of feminist historians in Iran. I also want to acknowledge the important ways that Professor Najmabadi's work travels outside the scholarly circle, both here, inside of Iran, and globally. She's given voice and, more importantly, a history to Iranian women, those who fall outside of normative gender sexual regimes, and so many other marginalized figures within the historiography of Iran. She's inspired us to look for new stories in old places and retrieve the paths that we can claim as our own. So let me begin, Professor Najmabadi, by thanking you for your pathbreaking work here in this book. I'm very excited to discuss with you today and throughout the last several decades of your scholarship. I know I speak for many of us today when I say it is an absolute honor to have you here. So, and with that, let me begin to the reason why we're here today, to discuss your latest book, Familial Undercurrents, Untold Stories of Love and Marriage in Modern Iran. I'm going to begin with some comments and questions, and hopefully that will be about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to a conversation with the audience, both online and in person. So, Familial Undercurrents faces the transition in the ideas of what constitutes family in late 19th and early 20th century Iran, how these changes came about, and how practices of everyday life adapted to them. The book is in many ways a thoughtful culmination of much of your work over the last few decades. As I was reading it, I was struck by how this project is a continuation of two strands of your work in particular. Theoretically, it's informed by some of the key insights in your seminal work, Women as Manufacturers and Men Without Fears, where you argue that the emergence of modernist discourse in Iran, that were the result of increased contact with Europe during the 19th century, produced rigid gender norms and codified conjugal and heteronormative practices, which broke away from homosocial order and some of the homosexual habits that accompanied them in earlier Orthodox society, and towards heteronormative conjugality and a nuclear family. Familial Undercurrents is a deep and very personal dive into this transitional moment in late 19th and early 20th century Iran. The second line of continuity I can share is that methodologically, the book is informed by your work over the last 13 plus years, on the Women's World in Modern Iran Digital Archive project, where you created an incredible repository of primarily 19th and early 20th century archival sources, which center not only women, but gender and sexual regimes, domesticity, intimacy, and affect as central sites of historical knowledge preservation. While Familial Undercurrents begins with your own personal family history, Women's World in Baghdad, Iran provides the oral histories and archival and material sources that connect that history to a larger moment of shift in the notion of family in Iran during the period under study, and shows that your father's secret family was not an exception, but a common practice informed by these shifts. Can you tell us a little bit about how the work came about? At what point did you decide to take a personal story and turn it into a book project?
As they say, I was taken aback by how within one generation, so short span of time, so much had changed in what had been acceptable in polygamy to what had become unacceptable. And I was intrigued by how this had come about in particular. So that is how I started thinking about this and thinking that my personal family history was worth investigating, especially as when other people would confirm that similar things had happened in their family, that after their father had died, they found out he had a second family. So that's what I wanted to do, try to figure out that transition in a very short one generation period.
This is a deeply personal work, and as you mentioned in the introduction, you're implicated in the story as both a character as well as a historian. You talk in the introduction about grappling with the ethics of reaching into the personal and private realm of people's lives and telling a story that people may not, or in many cases, do not want told. Obviously, this is the case with the story of your father and second family. You mentioned it's a history you could only write in the wake of your mother's passing. I was also particularly struck by your personal relationship to the history of Bibi Afsaneh or Bibi Khanum, which you just mentioned, the author of Mir-Djalali, Vices of Men, who you also have a long scholarly relationship with. You edited up, Tavakoli mentioned, her 1992 publication, but also a personal relationship with her descendants, as you just mentioned. Can you talk about how you negotiated these multiple positionalities in writing the book?
I'm not sure that there was not much to negotiate between these multiple positionalities, because I think they were all clearly there in how I had come to know some of these stories. So that, yeah, I don't know if there was much to negotiate. So maybe somebody else can talk to that.
Well, maybe I can comment, because I think what it felt like to me was, the personal connection was the beginning of the story, but your ability to kind of write a feminist history that moves away from judgment and shame and towards generating empathy for historical subjects was something that kind of allowed you to tell the story. Your commitment to that kind of narrative telling allowed you to ask. It felt like that, at least to me. I'm not sure if this is true. Maybe bit of a follow-up. The work, much like your older scholarship, is motivated by the desire to compensate for silences in history and give voice to the silence. In a sense, the book is an excavation of your own family history, read and contextualized through many other familial lives, in order to see kind of a larger world or a larger picture or make a larger argument. But as you put it so eloquently, there's a real tension between this instinct to give voice to the dead and the real desire of the dead to remain silent, which also runs throughout the book. So I guess that's the tension. I'm just trying to think of how do you navigate this tension as you're interviewing family members or family members of people that you have a scholarly relationship to.
Well, the tension that you're pointing to between the instinct of giving voice to the dead, I think this is actually a problem that is that what historians are doing, giving voice to the dead, or basically they are telling that story the way they have come to it and the way they want to present it to potential readers. So I think, this is I think part of the answer. We don't really know either of these. We don't know what the real desire of the dead would be, whether it would be to remain silent or not. This is just unknowable things. At best, we just assume we know it, but we don't really know it.
As you'll notice, I'm kind of giving more comments than question here, which is kind of the agreement. So I'll keep going with my comments. Pose some smaller questions. The book follows two major shifts, and you argue that these two shifts happened over a single generation, around the 1920s or 30s, when the idea of companionate and monogamous marriage and the conjugal couple as family gained their near imperial hegemony. And you borrow from Elizabeth Tavakoli-Targhi's work there. So the first is the ideal of family. The first is that the ideal of family shifts from a generationally expansive and a time polygamous structure to become conjugally centered rather than seniority focused. The second is that the ideal of marriage becomes a companionate and preferably monogamous marriage chosen by the partners. So rather than arranged by families, it's based on affection, mohabbat, if not love. To most contemporary readers, this would constitute a positive shift, a progressive aspect of modernity that offers women a better and more equitable life. But of course, your argument is not only that this was not a smooth transition, but it had broader social implications and also casualties. Can you talk about some of the implications of these shifts and which subjects emerge as the casualties of these transitions?
What do you mean by the casualties?
I mean, people that get left out of the story or marginalized when this shift takes place, that kind of fall outside of familial relations or historical characters that count.
Well, the two shifts that you're talking about is actually important in what marriage and family has become today. And yes, it's not a smooth transition, but it has had broader social implications. But what we have today is sort of the end result of that process, and how it has become now sort of accepted as a matter of fact, as something that goes without saying, and we don't even have to explain.
Yeah, but also sort of what happens to the figure of the Siva, for example. So
The figure of what?
if you think about the figure of the Siva in the late 1900s versus in 1930, like the sort of disappearance or shaming of that character. I think that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the kind of casualties of this shift.
Yeah, Siva did become something that was accepted and practiced, became sort of shameful, and in most modernist writings, they would consider it as legal prostitution. But I think more recently, people have come to visit Siva as such, and in particular, a lot of Muslim women have started using it for their own practices and for having sexual relationship outside marriage.
Okay, so again, throughout your book, you argue that the idea of marrying for love and monogamous conjugality emerged and dominated primarily within urban middle-class society in early 20th century Iran, especially for a sector of educated women who came to value monogamous companionate marriage. You show how the emerging print and media culture, so things like romantic novels, plays, writing about social life in Europe, later films, contribute to this shift. But of course, this shift also had cross-class implications. We see this, for example, as we mentioned, in the erasure and disappearance of Lauren Siva from family trees, photos, and narratives, their designation of prostitutes, as we just mentioned, or the emergence of street women as a category. However, most of the documents and narratives of familial formations you examine here are from upper and middle classes, with some women named and unnamed appearing and sometimes disappearing from their margins. How do you find better traces of these lower class and stigmatized women in the archives? So, for example, how can we think about how to trace the deeper narrative about the life or inner life of a figure like Tajirani that Bibi Khanum took for her husband and referred to as Bonnie? How and where may she appear in the archives when there's such an overt attempt to erase her by the family?
I'm not sure what else we could do except by trying to make sure we keep these figures within the archives and within our writing about that. And that's the best we could do. Some of them were probably lost and they have become irretrievable, but others, at least parts of aspects of their lives, we can access and make sure we include those in our archives.
Can you tell me the story about the family tree you drew of her? So is that something that the family did, where they kind of did a genealogy where they took her out and then you redrew it and put in her?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing. I mean, people do these family trees with particular inclusions and exclusions. And sometimes, in fact, the way they include some of these figures makes them even more bigamous than they had intended to.
For those of you who haven't seen the book, the family of Bibi Khanum, she herself actually had taken on this for her husband in order to be able to continue to run her school, right? That was the reason she brought in the Sifa. But then in her descendants, in drawing the family tree, they had kind of erased this. So you have kind of the family tree that Afsaneh Najmabadi redraws, bringing this woman back and showing that I think she also had her own daughters. Is that right? I'm trying to remember. It's complicated. Okay. The book is also striking for its use of various kinds of sources and archival materials. You make use of a wide range of more traditional sources in the period. So as I mentioned, early romantic novels and satirical plays, Islamic books of ethics, reform newspapers, and emerging women's press. But throughout the book, you read these sources in parallel with related objects, photographs,